The recording. All right, tonight is November 29th. It's 9 p.m. This is our first live class meeting for moral philosophy. We're going to be studying Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics with the help of St. Thomas. So we'll be doing both at the same time. We'll be learning from the commentary of St. Thomas as we read through the Ethics of Aristotle. I'll do the work of condensing St. Thomas's teaching. So we have it like that simple handout I just shared. I'll boil everything down to simple terms, and then we can talk through things, read it, discuss the lesson together, but walk away with that summary as an overview of what we covered. So I want to make sure we have everything we need here. We're studying Nicomachean ethics. I'm going to share my screen. I'll have everything on my screen that we need tonight, so you don't need to have anything with you. So up on the screen here, I have the entire Nicomachean Ethics on the CLA website. It's linked from the course page. So if you get into the CLA Study Center and go to Ethics, if you click on that Ethics Book 1, Chapter 1 lesson, it'll open up this page on the CLA website, and this has the whole book of Nicomachean Ethics with all of the chapters linked, so it's easy to use, all on one page. So you can, easily search for anything just using Control F on your keyboard. But that's all on the website. So we'll use this as our text to read through each week, and then we'll look at that overview of philosophy that I shared yesterday. Because yesterday we looked at rational philosophy, the second of these sciences. Today we're going to look at the third, which is moral philosophy. So we'll just go back, over that, make sure we see where we are, and then we'll read through the ethics, and we'll just walk through this summary and comment point by point, talk about point by point what St. Thomas has to say about the content, and we'll let that be sort of a launching pad for any discussions that come up, or questions, or just topics you'd like to dig into. And at the very worst, we won't get through everything, but you can keep that, and even if I don't get through it all, you'll still have it, and it'll be helpful. All right, so that's the plan for tonight. We're going to get through the first 3 chapters. So going back to that overview of philosophy, we talked about this last night. This may change a little bit week by week. I just keep thinking through it and tweaking it a little bit to make it clearer. But it comes from St. Thomas's commentaries on Aristotle's works. And what I like to do is just take all of Thomas's stuff, because sometimes it gets wordy. There's a lot of things where he'll write proofs for things that we really don't need, especially us, because we're already on board with scholastic philosophy. Most of us, we're already, open to it and trusting of it. So, I personally don't need to hear every single proof that St. Thomas has for every statement that he makes. Some of them are helpful. If I struggle to grasp something, it's nice to have the proof. But I think for most of us, knowing who's here and your backgrounds and interests, I don't think we're the kind of people that are ready to kick and fight against a lot of this stuff. We really want to be told what St. Thomas thinks, and there'd have to be some reason for us to question or doubt it. So I like to try to boil it down, make it simple. If in the future there was a point where you weren't sure about, or someone was giving you a hard time, like one of the guys last night said that he had a friend or relative bugging him about studying philosophy, that kind of thing, that's when I would recommend going and find, that spot in St. Thomas's writings and going through it carefully and reading through all the arguments and things like that, because you'll probably find something helpful. But most of the time, for Catholic men who are already trusting in St. Thomas, it's a lot of extra material. So what I like to do is just copy his commentary and then just filter out all the unnecessary stuff that I think goes beyond what we need, and just give us a boiled down list of bullet points that summarize everything for us. So that's where this overview of philosophy came from. We went over it last night. We saw that philosophy is the love or pursuit of wisdom. Everybody knows that. That's obvious. But what exactly wisdom is not so clear. And again, as Catholics, as a Catholic now, I take this for granted, but I can remember, I was a Protestant when I was, in my 20s. I was still in the Anglican Church. And I can remember having like Bible studies or book discussions and things like that, where we would talk about things like what is wisdom, and people have all different opinions and ideas. So I can remember that it's not as widely understood as we might think if we've been reading Thomas Aquinas or listening to the Thomistic Institute, stuff like that. It's pretty simple, but we can't take it for granted, because the people we're working with or talking to across, they don't necessarily know what wisdom is. So it's good to just take a minute and define that and make sure it's clear. St. Thomas said wisdom is the perfection of reason. We talked about that last night. Reason is a natural faculty, just like just like language, which is given to us by birth, just like our muscles. But just because we're given them and they have potential, that doesn't mean that they're good. We have to actually exercise them and develop them. And so if we were to take reason and thoroughly develop it, thoroughly work it and exercise it to fulfill its God's intention for it, that perfection of reason is what we would call wisdom. That's wisdom, the perfection of reason. I don't know why, but I just find that definition to be really helpful practically to think of it like that. Some more folks coming in. All right, so wisdom is the perfection or completion, the fulfillment of the end of reason, right? And then we talked about how reason relates to order. It's basically the work of reason to order things, to know and direct things according to true order. And there's 4 ways it does that. The first way, we observe order outside of ourselves, and that leads us to natural philosophy. The second way, we study to understand the order of our own reason and work to order that reason according to that science, and that leads us to rational philosophy. Then we talked about how reason can also order, first learn, and then secondly, order our will, and that's moral philosophy, where we study and pursue that. And then lastly, the last kind of order is where reason, through planning, produces works outside of us, and we do that through mechanical arts. And obviously there's a million different levels and types of mechanical arts, from very simple things up to very complicated things. So there's 4 kinds of order, which leads to 4 philosophical sciences. Last night we talked about rational philosophy. Tonight we're getting into moral philosophy. So moral philosophy considers the order of voluntary actions, and you'll see that human is in parentheses here. St. Thomas clarifies, he takes, makes an effort to clarify that the only actions that are properly human actions are those that are voluntary. So, our body does all kinds of things naturally. Our heart beats, we breathe, all sorts of activities going on naturally, but they're not human actions. They're just animal actions, right? So there's a difference. There are actions that, irrational animals share with us, that we do the same things. But then there are actions that only humans do, and they largely pertain to reason and to the will. So our voluntary actions, the things we do voluntarily, are really what Thomas would call human actions, okay? And that's what we're talking about in moral philosophy. Voluntary actions where the will, which animals don't have, the will is actually engaged in making choices and doing things intentionally, voluntarily. And through moral philosophy, we're seeking to study what those actions should be, first of all, what our will should be. And then as we learn the science of moral philosophy, we apply it and actually discipline ourselves. Reason sort of takes control of our will, like a horse, like a rider on a horse. And reason begins to control it and make sure that it acts according to wisdom. And so that's the end of moral philosophy, to understand what it should do in the first place, and then to actually work to do that. That's what a life of self-control looks like. So moral philosophy is the topic for us tonight, and obviously the source of our teaching is going to be Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is a big book. It's 10 books, all contained in one study, but it contains the entire science of moral philosophy. And after we study Nicomachean Ethics, if we want to go further, we can also study Aristotle's Politics, where we'll see by the end of tonight why politics follows up on ethics. But that's our topic for Wednesday nights, moral philosophy, the third of these divisions of the sciences that lead us to wisdom, okay? So last night, rational philosophy, tonight, moral philosophy. I'm not sure if we're going to, I think we're doing natural philosophy tomorrow night, so we'll get into that one too. We won't do mechanical arts. If you want mechanical arts, you need to become an apprentice someplace. That's where you learn those things, but we'll do the first three. All right, so that's that. So let's get into this here. Book 1, chapter 1, and Aristotle's going to lay out for us the purpose of this study. He's going to explain what we're trying to accomplish. Remember, in historical context, this was not known. This science of ethics, Aristotle established this science by applying demonstrative reasoning as the method, as the instrument. He established that tool, as it were, and then used it to discover and teach the science of moral philosophy. So this orderly, systematic explanation of moral philosophy didn't exist before Aristotle. He created this. And so as he introduces things, there are some new ideas that he introduces, and he bears the burden of proof. He's introducing them to his philosophical community, as it were. They've already got opinions on these things. They've already heard Platonic dialogues on these things. They know other ancient philosophers who have talked about these things. And sometimes Aristotle bucks the whole system and sort of, blazes his own trail, and he takes upon himself the burden to prove what he's saying. And he does that for us here, which is helpful. Sometimes we really don't need that proof, like I said before, because we're living 2,400 years later. We sort of know the end of the story and what happened to Plato and Aristotle. But at the time, he was a trailblazer, and he was introducing all of this fresh. So sometimes he goes overboard with proofs as far as we're concerned, but in his day, it was necessary. All right, it's very easy to read. There's, once in a while, you'll run into some vocabulary that's kind of wonky, to use an expression some of my UK students taught me, some wonky vocabulary. But other than that, I mean, the study of moral philosophy is really not that difficult. It's just the danger of moral philosophy is we tend to think we know more than we do. We tend to think that we already have this figured out. It's like an illustration I give my younger students is, if I ask you if you know what a cat looks like, everybody says yes. And if I ask you to draw a cat, all of a sudden no one can draw a cat. And what everybody does is arrogantly say they're just not good at drawing, right? They won't admit that they really don't know what a cat looks like, and that's why they can't draw it. And we tend to do the same thing in a subject like moral philosophy. If I say, hey, does everybody know what greed is? Does everybody know what courage is? Everyone in the room is going to say yes. And then if I say, okay, define it, then there's silence. No one really knows what it is, but we have this familiarity with these terms and concepts that we confuse with real understanding of them. So it's good for us to go through these studies and just make sure we're constantly checking our thoughts against what Aristotle actually teaches, and not just assuming we already know this and skimming through the readings, because we really don't know this in modern society. We've got to be careful. We've got to study it and sort of establish this positive philosophy in our souls, and be careful to stick to the texts. Okay, so let's just try to avoid the fault of assuming we know things that we're just familiar with, right? That's the danger in moral philosophy. So in chapter 1 here, we're just going to read through this. If you have any questions, you can open up your mics. I think most of you are in quiet environments. So if you've got a question or want to comment on something as we go through this, just interrupt me. Okay, that's just how we'll do things. It's all right, because I'm going to be looking at the screen over here. So book 1, chapter 1, Aristotle says, every art and every method, and in like manner, every action and every deliberate choice appears to aspire after a certain good. When my younger students study this, they usually get hung up on this list. Every art, every method, every action, every deliberate choice, and they start, panicking that they don't know exactly what all these things are. What does he mean by art? What does he mean by method? What exactly is an action? What's a deliberate choice? Well, we're going to study all that stuff in this book. So we don't know all of these things yet, but it's simple to understand what he's talking about because we already know what this science is concerned with. It's concerned with voluntary human actions. And all he's done there is list a number of different examples of places where we find voluntary human actions. An art, for example, it's not some natural process. It's not breathing. An art is something that man does intelligently, intentionally. It's a human action. A method, or science, again, is an intentional, systematic knowledge that man develops and possesses. It's not just some natural process. It's voluntary and intentional. Every action that man voluntarily undertakes, a human action, right? One that comes from the will. And deliberate choice, a choice or decision a man makes after deliberating. So a controversial issue that man has to wrestle with different options for, and then he finally makes a choice after deliberating. All these are voluntary human actions, okay? So what he's saying there is just all voluntary human actions, all voluntary actions appear to aspire after a certain good. In other words, we don't do things in vain. Human beings don't act in sort of random chaos. Every time someone is participating in a voluntary human action, he's doing so in pursuit of some good. It could be some simple, relatively, irrelevant good, or it can be some, chief end of life good. But every voluntary action that the human soul undertakes is done in hope of obtaining some good. And therefore, he says, it is well said by ancient philosophers that the good is that which all things desire. The good is that which all things desire. Now, this is controversial because this is where like modern relativism comes from, right? This idea, if we read this wrongly, we end up as a bunch of relativists, because it says the good is that which all things desire. So when I look over and see the drug addict on the side of the road shooting up on heroin, I say, well, he's not really doing anything bad. Well, he's seeking good as he understands it. And therefore it's not really evil. It's just his own idea of what's good. And this guy over here doing his own thing, don't say it's sin. Don't call him evil. That's not true. He's not doing anything bad. He's seeking good in his own way, according to his own idea of what the good is. We can take a statement like that, the good is that which all things desire, tear it out of its context, and turn it into this wacky principle of relativism. But that's not what it teaches, because we're going to see Aristotle goes on, and the whole point of these first 2 chapters is to actually say that the good of the individual is actually not the chief end of the individual. So that whole idea that the good is that which all things desire, therefore anything anyone desires is good, that's an impossible interpretation of that saying. And we'll see that as we go through. But that's a good point for discussion and controversy. But at the same time, it is true that people are doing evil things because they're deceived and think that good might come out of it. That's true. That actually is what motivates them. It's like the end justifies the means. They can say, well, I'm a good person. I never meant to hurt anybody. Yeah, but you just like killed 6 people, right? I mean, I understand that your intention was supposedly to not do any harm, but you actually did harm. And so we've got this confusion in modern society that we hear every time there's a crime on the news. We've got to hear how every mass murderer is a good person, never intended to hurt anybody, and so on. It's because there's more to the moral life than just the individual, all right? And there is controversy because this is also why we do have to be merciful, because people are deceived by many things. Anytime we lie, we are deceived. We think that lying will allow us to obtain the good. Anytime someone does evil, it's because they're deceived. They think that in order to obtain happiness, they have to do something evil. And that's what sin is. It's based on deception. They're seeking what appears to them to be good, but they're deceived as to the means by which to obtain it. So there is some truth to that interpretation, and that's where works of mercy come from. Just realizing that people are honestly deceived. They're not knowingly doing evil. Many of them, or most of them even, don't know what they do, as Jesus said when he prayed on the cross. They don't understand what they're doing. So the good is that which all things desire. All right, now we get into the ends. Of ends, so all actions aim at some end. All actions, all human actions, and you know what we mean by human actions, all actions that proceed from the will. All human actions aspire after some ends, and there are different kinds of ends. Of ends, there appears to be a certain difference. Some of them are energies, and others of them are certain works. So all voluntary actions are aiming at good or some end, and there are two kinds of ends, energies and works. And this is an example of some wonky vocabulary, right? This word energies. When students read this, no one has any clue what this means. You're not going to find it in a dictionary. And what I teach the kids and what I'd advise everybody is that when we're reading Aristotle, especially the Thomas Taylor translation, if you come to a word that you don't know the meaning of, don't think that you can hop to a dictionary and grab a meaning. It doesn't work that way. What I tell the kids is just make a note of that word, jot it down, and then just continue reading and start paying attention and keep an eye out for that word, and just slowly build the meaning of that word based on what Aristotle actually says about it and how he uses it. Because you've got to be careful not to read definitions in, because they'll get you screwed up in all kinds of ways, because that's not what they mean. We can tell, though, in context, if we just keep reading here, and this is what I teach the kids, if we just keep reading, we'll be able to deduce from the text what this is referring to, this idea of energies. So there's two ends, two different kinds of ends men seek. One kind are energies, and the other are certain works. So let's just keep reading and we'll see this explained. In those things in which there are certain ends besides the actions, in these the works are naturally adapted to be better than the energies. In those things where there are certain ends besides the actions, in these the works. So the idea of works is things that are produced outside of the person. So things that we produce outside of us, things we aim for or desire that are outside of us, those are works. Like when we say the works of William Shakespeare, it's the things that William Shakespeare produced. That's what we mean here by works, products, things that are made that are external to the person doing the action. Those are works. Energies is equivalent to the word actions. Actions are energies. There are some ends that remain in us. For example, thinking is an action. It's an action that we perform voluntarily, but all of that action stays within us. That's what he means by energies. All right. So there are some things that we do, and we do them for the sake of the activity itself, and that activity remains with us. And there are other things that we do, other ends, where we seek to produce something external to ourselves. Those are works. The others are energies. They remain within us. okay? So praying, for example, would be an example of an energy. It's something that we do that doesn't produce a work directly, doesn't produce a work. We do it, and all of the benefit of it remains within us. That's the idea of an energy. Exercising, working out. Working out is an energy. It's an activity. It doesn't produce a work outside of us. All of the benefit of it remains within us. So that's an energy. A work would be building a table, making a snowman, something that's produced outside the body. So there's two kinds of ends, energies and works. Energies are actions that remain with us. The ends actually remain within us. Works are actions where the ends are produced outside of us. So two kinds of ends. And now Aristotle asks, well, are there differences of these ends? Can we rank these ends? Are some ends more important than other ends? And the answer to that question is yes. And he gets into that in this next paragraph. There are many actions in arts and sciences, and therefore there are also many ends. The end of medicine is health. The end of shipbuilding is a ship. That would be an example of a work. The end of the military art would be victory. The end of the economic art would be wealth. So all of these different arts, all of these different actions, all of these different sciences, they aim or aspire at some end, either an energy or a work. But there's a hierarchy of these things. They're not all equal. They're not all the same. There's a hierarchy. Such arts as are of this kind are arranged under one certain power. So there's a hierarchy of arts. The bridle making art, so the art of making bridles for horses, is arranged under the equestrian art. And what that means is that the equestrian man, the horse rider, tells the bridle maker how to make the bridle. The bridle maker doesn't just wake up and say, oh, I've got some cool ideas for bridles, and he doesn't ride horses. And then he makes the bridle and gives it to the horse rider, and the horse rider is like, what is this? This doesn't even work. The horse rider is the more noble end, the riding of the horse. He instructs the bridle maker how the bridle needs to be made, because bridle making is inferior and subservient to horse riding, right? So there's a hierarchy of ends that can be established. And such other arts as pertain to equestrian instruments. This art, however, the art of horse riding, and every other warlike action are arranged under the military art. So the general of the army commands the horse riders how they're to ride their horses. The horse rider, who's responsible for riding the horse, commands the bridle maker how the bridle needs to be made. And we see this hierarchy develop in human society. After the same manner, other arts are arranged under other powers. So it's true of other areas as well. All areas are arranged like this. In all these, the ends of those arts, which are architectonic, here's another vocab word, architectonic, or master arts, that's what that means. An architectonic art is an art that is superior to another art. It's an art to which other arts are subservient. The ends of those arts which are architectonic are more eligible, that means desirable, more noble, than all the ends of the arts which are subordinate to the master arts. For the latter are pursued for the sake of the former. So if we just stop there a minute, once he establishes this idea of a hierarchy of arts, a hierarchy of ends, it leads us to a logical conclusion, which is that, wait a minute, if there's a hierarchy of ends, then there's got to be one that's the highest of all, right? There's got to be some chief end, some highest good, the summum bonum, right? The idea of the highest good, the chief end. So we're seeing Aristotle prove and establish this argument that all of the activities of human beings, it's not all random activity. Like, it may feel like that. It may feel like everybody's just got their own job, everybody's got their own thing, we're all equal, blah, blah, blah. But that's not true, because this guy and his industry actually direct these guys in their industry. and that industry is directed by this thing, and this thing is directed by that government agency. And so if we step back and organize all of these different activities and arts and ends, we'll see that there's a big, huge hierarchy of these things in human society. And that leads us to the question, what is it that sits at the top of this hierarchy? What is the chief end that sits at the top and orders everything from the top down? That's going to be the question that should, arise within us. And pursuing the answer to that question is what we're going to do in chapter 2 here. So he does this to prove and show very clearly with the use of bridle making and horse riding and military action. He shows that there's a hierarchy, that everything is not equal, but some arts are subservient to others. Some human actions are subservient to other human actions. And that sort of prepares us for the question, what then would the highest art be? And we're going to get into that in chapter 2. He makes this last sentence here. It makes no difference whether the energies are the ends or something else works in the same manner as in the above mentioned sciences. It makes no difference if they're energies or works. So works aren't automatically more noble than energies. Energies aren't necessarily more noble than works. When we build this hierarchy, we're going to see that there may be an energy that ranks higher than a work, which is subservient. And then in another place, we'll see that there's a work that ranks higher than an energy. And there's no necessary relationship between whether an end is a work or an energy and whether one is higher than the other. That's not what organizes things. It's something else. There's some other organizing principle. And this is the order that reason leads us to seek. What is it that organizes everything? What's the ultimate organizing principle of all human actions? And so now we're going to get into that in chapter 2 here. If therefore there is a certain end of action which we wish to obtain for its own sake, so here come the qualifications for this ultimate end. Something that we wish to obtain for its own sake. We don't seek it for the sake of something else. It's not subordinate to anything else. We wish to obtain it for its own sake, and we desire other things on account of this. And our choice is not directed to all things for the sake of something else. And then he gets into this little side note here, which I'm going to skip. It is evident that this end will be the good and that which is the most excellent. So here he gives us the qualifications for the ultimate or most excellent end. He says, there is a certain end which we wish to obtain for its own sake, and everything else that we desire in life, every other action that we participate in voluntarily, is aimed at this end. That is the most excellent end. So we've got the qualities of that most excellent end. Now we need to investigate and figure out what exactly that would be. Okay, so in chapter 1, he just establishes this principle, first of all, that all voluntary human actions aim at some end, and there are different kinds of ends. Everything that humans do voluntarily aims at some end. There's a hierarchy of ends because some are subordinate to others. That leads us to this, contemplation that there must be some most excellent or some chief end. How do we identify the chief end? Well, there are two qualifications. First, it's something that we desire for its own sake. And second, it's something that everything else is desired for its sake. So if we can identify something where those two qualifications are true, we'll have identified the chief end. And that's the aim, the first aim, I should say, of the science of moral philosophy. And then he goes into just a rhetorical question here, thinking about archers. Like, could you imagine being an archer and not having a target to aim at? What in the world would an archer do? Would he just, the whole art of archery would make no sense if there wasn't a target. And then he asks, will not therefore the knowledge of this most excellent end be of great importance with respect to life? We're like archers. We have to know the mark to aim at. And, by identifying this mark, we can then order our entire life so that everything that we do is ordered, or, to use modern language, aligned according to this one chief end. We have to know what that chief end is, and then work through the application of moral philosophy to bring our will into order so that everything we do aligns with that chief end. Okay? It would seem that this belongs to that power which is the most principal and is especially architectonic. So architectonic, again, means master or superior art. Whatever art then is the most architectonic, the most principal, that must be the most excellent end. And then he gets right to it here and gives us the answer. The political science, and this always surprises everybody. Political science appears to be a thing of this kind. So this is Aristotle's answer to the question, what is the most excellent art that directly serves the highest end? His answer is, it's political science. It's the study of the ordering of the state. That's the highest end. Now, usually when Christians hear this, they object and they say, no, that's not the highest end. The highest end is heaven or eternal life. But remember, this is philosophy. This is not a theology class. This is wisdom according to human reasoning. So we're not bringing divine revelation into this. We can't talk about heaven or eternity or salvation when we're dealing with human reason. So Aristotle's answering this question based on what can be known by human observation and reason. And humanly speaking, and if you've ever read the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, Solomon likes to use the phrase under the sun to talk about this. I've observed all things under the sun. That idea of looking at things that belong to earthly life according to human reason. That's how Aristotle's approaching this question. And his answer is, humanly speaking, the chief end of man is pursued through political science, which is the next phase of moral philosophy, right? Seeking the common good, what we call the common good, the good of all men, the good of the state. That's the highest end to which all things are directed. Because just think about it. The military is a very noble end, right? Military action. The goal of military action is victory, but for what end? For the common good, for the good of the state. Rhetorical art is very good, right? Learning to speak and persuade men and, bring about all of these good outcomes of deliberations that need to take place. That's a noble end. But what's the purpose of the rhetorical art? It's to serve the common good. It's subject to political science. And if we go through all of the different arts and all of the different science, all the different industries, and ask, to what end should all of these things be directed? The answer is the common good, the good of everyone, right? The happiness of everyone in the state. And that goal, that end of common happiness shared by all men is the object of political science. So that's the highest and most noble of all sciences, according to Aristotle. And then he goes through just some simple proofs to explain that. Now, for us, I don't know if everybody here is in America. I don't think they are, but in America, we sort of have this stuff forced down our throats all the time because we live in a democracy. We're constantly talking about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and how the country was ordered for the common good and all. We're very conscious of this. But again, this was relatively radical stuff for Aristotle to get into, because in a monarchy where you've got these ancient Eastern monarchies, the king was not responsible for any common good. The king was responsible for his own will. I mean, he was the head of everything. He was the chief end. Might makes right in ancient Eastern monarchies. It wasn't until later that some of the rulers like Cyrus started to realize that it's a lot better to seek the common good than to just try to enslave the entire population. But this idea of pursuing the common good as being the end of all human actions, that's really an Aristotelian idea. And we can see how Aristotelian philosophy and democracy and all these different issues are kind of bubbling up together in ancient Greece because of these discussions, even though Aristotle didn't promote democracy because he didn't think the common people were smart enough to seek the common good. He thought it should be, the state should be governed by aristocrats, by the best and wisest men. But anyway, chapter 2, the main point here is that Aristotle explains what the highest end appears to be, and that the science which leads us to understand and serve the highest end would be the political science. Now, the challenge of that is that we have to accept the reality that we've got to submit our own desires or our own inclinations to the good of the entire state. So you can see that moral philosophy leads to a willingness to sacrifice individual interests. And so because that's the case, in chapter 3, Aristotle goes on to explain what is required of a person to be a student of moral philosophy. Not everyone can be a student of moral philosophy. So he talks about what's required for the study, because it requires sort of it requires a certain moral disposition to begin with, to be willing to accept the responsibility of seeking the common good and studying to understand and pursue the common good. First of all, he says that young people can't study this. It's not a study that young people can engage in, because young people don't have enough experience to understand the value and significance of the common good. So that's the first qualification, is that you need to be of sufficient age where you've got some experience in life, where you've gone through some trials and tribulations, you've been cheated and defrauded by people, you know what the consequences of your own sinful actions are, and you become a little more sober as to the fact that just chasing after your own interest is really not the means to make yourself happy. You've got to have some experience in the world to have an appreciation for that. That's the first thing. And then secondly, you've got to have some virtue, because you can't be a person who's a slave to emotions. You can't be emotional. You can't just, follow the sort of irrational impulses of natural passions. You've got to have some self-control to be able to order your passions by reason. Not that they're developed, not that that's developed and mature yet, because that's the object of this study, but there's got to be a disposition to do that ordering of the will, a willingness to do that in order to be a student of moral philosophy. And you've got to have self-control. You cannot be incontinent, or incontinent, that's the word. So there are some prerequisites to be a student of moral philosophy. That's what he covers in chapter 3. It's really very simple, because the goal of moral philosophy is not to know these things. It's not just an intellectual study. It's actually a study that is not finished until it's put into practice, until you actually become this good man. That's the end of moral philosophy. So for chapters 1 to 3, that's the content. And I'll spare reading that, but chapter 3, he simply discusses the goal of moral philosophy, which is to be a good man, and what the prerequisites are to become a student of moral philosophy. So when you talk about a placement test and somebody says, can I study moral philosophy? There are a couple of requirements. You've got to have some experience in the world to respect these things, first of all. You've got to be willing to subject yourself to the benefit of, the community. And then secondly, you've got to have some evidence that you're the kind of person who has emotions under control and is willing to exercise self-control, because these things are going to contradict your own selfish desires, even though they might be good with respect to the individual. But like St. Paul says, he says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. So there's a difference. There's a difference between, me being allowed to do something and it actually being the best thing for me to do. You've got to be a person who's sensitive to things like that, or this is going to be a waste of time. So that's the content of chapters 1 through 3. All right. Now, we've only got a few minutes left, and I just want to show you this. What I did was I took all of St. Thomas's commentary. all of St. Thomas's commentary, and I just distilled it into these points. And I intend for you to take this and keep this, and you can just read through this yourself. But I think it gives you a really good summary of everything in those first 3 chapters. In St. Thomas's way of saying things very succinctly and clearly. But I've just removed all of the wordage and stuff that's not necessary. So this is I think it's the first 3 lectures of St. Thomas Aquinas on Aristotle's Ethics boiled down into just 25 points. And I didn't leave anything out. I didn't skip any important points. I just boiled it down to the point that he's making. And these are his words. I didn't change the wording much or anything like that. These are actually his words, but I just took all of the other information out of the commentary and left this summary of the points that he makes to comment on this. And you'll see it's all the stuff we talked about. Just to go through it real quick, the order of voluntary actions pertains to the consideration of moral philosophy, right? We discussed that. It's proper to moral philosophy to consider human operations. I'll put that in italics. It's proper to moral philosophy to consider human operations insofar as they're ordered to an end. Human operations are those springing from man's will. Man is a part of a group. This is why, when I said before that idea that all things desire the good does not justify relativism, it's because man is not created to live by himself. He exists in community from birth. So the idea that whatever is good for him denies the reality that he's born into a natural community, not as an individual. So man's a part of a group, and that group furnishes him with help to live well. Man is not intended to live alone, but the quality of life that God intends for man is only possible when man lives and participates in community life. Moral philosophy is divided into 3 parts: individual ethics, domestic ethics, and political science. There are 2 principles of human acts: the intellect, where reason resides, and the appetite, which is natural, more like animal actions. Good is what all men desire. Men desire evil insofar as they think it to be good, and that's usually the effect of temptation and deception. Natural desire tends to good under the direction of the divine intellect. In other words, men are inclined to what is good. That's confusing to understand, but God has designed men, like St. Augustine says, we're all restless. Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, that idea. There's this sort of underlying attraction that comes from God to all creatures, and all creatures have this, this invisible tug on their souls that's drawing them to God. Even though they're evil, they're still inclined to good, which is a weird combination, but that's what philosophy teaches, what St. Thomas teaches. Natural desire tends to good because it's directed by the divine intellect, by God's own will. There is a diversity of ends among human actions. There are 2 kinds of ends: one where the action remains in itself, another where it passes over into external matter, that's works. The end is more important than the means. It makes no difference whether the end is a product or an activity. That's not what determines one is better than the other. There is some supreme end of human affairs. It's necessary to know what that end is in order to direct our lives. The reason is that a natural desire is nothing else but an inclination belonging to things by the disposition of the first mover. This is a proof that Aristotle gives, or St. Thomas gives, to show that actions and ends don't just go on forever. They actually come to a point where there's a final end. Because if there was no final end, our desire would just go on forever and lead us to eternal frustration, and that would be impossible. Man's whole life ought to be ordered to the supreme end. That's why it's so important to know it. We should understand this end in its general outlines, because it's impossible to know it with any scientific detail, and we'll talk about that later in the readings. It belongs to political science to consider the supreme end. Political science, these are the proofs for that. Political science ordains the other sciences. political science orders other sciences. Give you a few examples of that: military, economics, the government itself. It's all directed at the end of the state. And the use of subordinate sciences belongs to political science. Political science uses other sciences to serve its own end, and not vice versa. The end of the political science is the good of man. That is the supreme end of human things. The good is the same for one man and for the whole state. That's the principle of the golden rule, which Jesus teaches. Same idea taught in Aristotle. The end of the political science is not knowledge, not for us to know political science, but to actually carry it out. So the test is human action. No one can be a good student unless he has some knowledge of what he ought to study. A young man doesn't have knowledge of things belonging to moral science because he lacks experience, and emotional and incontinent men cannot study moral philosophy. So that's a summary. I'm sorry I just rambled for 50 minutes. I just wanted to get through all of that because we only meet once a week to discuss each of these subjects. I wanted you to at least see what's in this summary here. And again, this is from the commentary of St. Thomas, which you can access. If you just Google commentary of St. Thomas on Aristotle's Ethics, you'll find a link to it. But that's a helpful summary of the content. So if you take that and then read over the chapters on your own, I think it's really all you need to understand it. It's not that difficult. We're going to run into some difficulty in chapters 5 and 6 because it gets pretty philosophical, but we'll work through that. And then once we get into the real stuff of moral philosophy, it's fun because we just go through all of the different vices. We study them all one by one. We learn the concept of the golden mean in virtue and vice. We go through all the virtues and we get really clear descriptions of everything. And that's just, I think, the most helpful study anywhere. When people get in touch with me for the first time and ask, where should I begin my studies? I always tell them moral philosophy, not because of this stuff, but because once you get past this introductory stuff and you actually get into the heart of the subject, it's just a detailed study of all virtues individually and all vices individually. And that stuff is just so helpful for anything, for just like learning how to live and sanctify yourself, learning how to make a confession and examine yourself. It's very hard to examine yourself and make confession when you don't even know what vices are. You don't even have a clear sense of what vices and virtues are. So very beneficial to the Catholic life practically. So anyway, that's all for what I wanted to share. And again, I'm sorry I blitzed through a lot of this stuff, but the videos will be recorded, so anything can be reviewed. I'll always leave you with some stuff to take and be able to look through as a summary. But I just want to try to make these meetings as helpful as I can, because when I participate in meetings like this, I'm hoping that the teacher or the leader of the meeting, the host, gives me something, gives me something rich to take away, and maybe there's something new here and there. And I just like these meetings to be, to have lots of content for you. So once we finish, I'm happy to hang out and chat about anything you'd like to talk about. If there's any resources I can help you get connected with, we did some of that last night. Just anything I can do to help, or if there's some of these topics you'd just like to dig into and talk about, I'm happy to hang out for a little while. So that's what I'll plan to do each class. And like I said, the videos will be recorded for any review, or if you can't make a class, it's no big deal. But we can hang out afterwards if you'd like to talk about any of the topics and dig in. And then it also doesn't annoy the whole group to have one person asking 50 questions and wanting to get into discussions that the group isn't interested in. So that's how I plan to host things each week. All right. So that's all for chapters 1 through 3 of the Ethics. We've laid out the goal of moral philosophy. We've already answered the question, what is the most excellent end in the human life? It's pursued through the political science. The most excellent end is the common good. And now for the rest of this study, we're just going to dig into the details and learn this science and put ourselves to the test by whether we put it into practice or not. So I hope that's helpful. Let me just shut this stuff down here. And if anyone would like to talk about anything, feel free to just go open mic once I close things up here.